So by the end of this section, you'll be able to implement forms with different kinds of input fields, such as text boxes, checkboxes, radio buttons, and drop-down lists. You'll be able to display validation errors next to input fields and disable the submit button if the form is not in a valid state. So now let's get started. Alright, we're going to start this section by creating a simple Bootstrap form. And then we're going to bring that to life and add some validation to it using Angular. So here, let's open up the terminal and generate a new component. So ngGC, let's call this contact-form. Okay, now let's go to contact.html, delete all the markup here. We want to add a form. We don't need this action attribute. Inside this form, we need two input fields. One is the first name and the other is comment. So once again, I'm going to use Zen coding to quickly generate markup. So first we need a label. Next to this, we want an input. I want the type of this input to be text. So note that you can use square brackets to put any attributes here. Now this input field should have a class called form-control. And this is one of the classes defined in Bootstrap that gives our input field a nice modern look and feel. So tab, this is our markup. Let's break it up. So with this input field, we can set an ID here. Let's call this first name. And note that I'm using camel notation. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase and the first letter of every word after is uppercase. Now, if we use this ID here as the value for the for attribute of the label, this improves the accessibility of our form. So when the user clicks on this label, this input field here will automatically get focus. Okay. Now, finally, we need to wrap these two elements inside a div with the class form-group. This is one of the requirements by Bootstrap. So we want a div with the class form-group. Now let's move this stuff here. Okay. Now this time I'm going to generate all this markup in one go. So we want to start with a div with the class form-group. Now inside this div, we want a label, and this label should have an attribute called for set to, let's say, comment. Now next to this label, we want an input with an ID attribute set to comment. Actually, let's change this to a text area so we can have multiple lines. Now this text area should also have a class called form-control. Tab. Okay, here's our markup. Here's our div. We have a label inside that. And next to that, we have a text area. We don't need this name attribute, so let's delete this. And here's the closing div element. Now finally, we need a button. This button should have two classes. One is btn and the other is btn-primary. And let's call this submit. Now one more thing is that each of these label elements need a value. So the first one should be first name and the second should be comment. Okay. Now finally, let's use this form on our home page. First, let's go to contact.ts. I want to change the selector here. We don't really need this app-prefix. It's extra noise. Add it only if it's clashing with another component defined somewhere else, something that you're importing from a third-party library. So finally, let's go to app.html, delete all the markup here, and add our contact-form element. Now let's preview this. So back in the browser, this is our contact form. So first name, comment, and our submit button. So we have built this simple form. Now we want to add validation to it. In Angular, we have a class called form-control. For each input field in our form, we need to create an instance of the control class. And with this control class, we can check the current value stored in an input field. We can see if the input field has been touched or untouched. We can see if it's dirty, which means its value is changed, or pristine, which means its value is not changed. whether it's valid or not, and if it's not, what are the validation errors. So for each input field in the form, we need a control object. Now, similar to the control class, we have another class called form group, which represents a group of controls in a form. Each form is essentially a control group because it contains at least one control. But in a complex application, you might have a form with multiple control groups. For example, you might have a control group for the shipping address and another for the billing address. Now, interestingly, all the properties of the control class that you saw earlier are also available in the form group class as well. So we can ask a form group if it's valid or not. And that returns true if all the controls in that group are valid. Similarly, we can get all the validation errors in that group. So accessing these properties of a form group is easier than iterating over all the controls in that group and checking their status. So to add validation to a form, we need to create a form group object for the form and a form control object for each input field in the form. This way, we can keep track of the state of each input field and the entire form as a whole. Now, there are two ways to create these control objects. One way is by applying some directives in our template, and Angular will create these control objects for us implicitly under the hood. We call forms that are built this way template-driven forms. So we build them using their template. Another approach involves explicitly creating these control objects. So in our components, we should write code to create new instances of the control group and control objects. We call forms that are built this way as reactive forms. Previously, they used to be called model-driven forms. Now they are called reactive forms. Now you might ask, what is the difference? What is the difference between template-driven forms and reactive forms? The difference is that when we create these control objects explicitly, we have more control over their validation logic. So if you want to build a complex form with complex validation, you need to use reactive forms. You need to create these control objects explicitly. And also, another benefit of this approach is that you can unit test the validation logic of your form. Otherwise, if you want to build a simple form with some basic validation, like making some fields required or within a given range, then you can use template-driven forms. So template-driven forms are easier to create. We write less code, but we have also less control over the validation of our form. Now, in this section, we're going to look at template-driven forms, and we'll leave reactive forms to the next section. So we have built this basic Bootstrap form. Now we want to add validation to this using template-driven approach. So as I explained in the last lecture, with template-driven approach, we apply a directive to our input field, and Angular will create a control object and associated with that input field under the hood. Now guess what? You already know this directive. That is ngModel. So here on this first name input field, I'm going to apply the ngModel directive. We used this before with the two-way binding syntax or banana in a box. Remember that? So we used it like this. Here's a box, here's a banana, and we used ngModel like this and bound this to a property or a field in our component, like first name. Now here we don't need two-way binding yet. Perhaps we can add this in the future, but all I want to show you is that when you apply the ngModel directive on an input field, in its simplest form, without any binding, Angular will create a control object and associate it with this input field under the hood. Now, let's preview this in the browser. So back in Chrome, we get this error. If ngModel is used within a form tag, either the name attribute must be set or the form control must be defined as standalone. So basically, the reason we got that error is that we didn't set a name attribute here. This is a requirement because every time we apply this ngModel on an input field, and it needs a way to distinguish these control objects. So here we set the name attribute. I'm going to use the same value as the ID. So first name. Save. Now back in the browser, the error is gone. Now I want to show you that control object under the hood. So these two attributes are all you need to set in order to use the template-driven approach. But in this video, I want to show you what is happening under the hood. So I want to handle the change event of this input field. And here we're going to call the log method. Now I need a reference to this ngModel directive. I want to pass that reference to the log method so we can log it on the console. For that, we're going to create a template variable. So hashtag, let's call that template variable first name. You could call it anything. And as the value, I'm going to use ngModel. So when Angular sees this, it's going to set this template variable to the ngModel directive that is applied on this input field. Okay? And then we can pass this variable to our log method. So here's the log method. We pass first name. Now let's go and implement this method. So back in our component, I'm going to delete the stuff that we don't need. Let's just keep it simple. Here's the log method. Let's give it a parameter called x and simply log it on the console. This is just for diagnostics. Now back in the browser, I'm going to type my name here, press tab. Now let's take a look at the console. Okay, here's our ngModel. So you can see ngModel is an object with these properties. Now look at this property, control. This is the control object that I was telling you about. Now if you click on the value, look, it's an instance of the form control class in Angular. Let's expand this. Here we have a bunch of properties, and many of these properties come in pairs. For example, we have this dirty, which determines if the value of the input field is changed from the moment the form was initialized. In this case, because I typed my name here, dirty is true. Now the opposite property is pristine. Pristine means clean. So dirty should be true and pristine is false. Okay? Now we have another pair, invalid and valid. In this case, because we haven't implemented validation yet, this input field is considered valid. So invalid should be false and valid should be true. Now, if we have any validation errors, they're available here. Currently, errors is null because we don't have any errors. We have another pair, which is touched and untouched. In this case, because I touched the input field, or in other words, I put the focus there and then moved away, touched should be true and untouched should be false. We have another important property, value, which returns the current value in the input field. So what I want you to note here is that we use this form control class to track state changes and the validity of input fields. When we apply the ngModel directive along with the name attribute on an input field, Angular automatically creates an instance of the form control class and associates it with this input field. Now to finish up this lecture, I'm going to apply ngModel on our text area as well and set the name attribute to comment. In the next lecture, we're going to add some validation here. All right, now let's make this first name field required. So in HTML5, we can use this required attribute on an input field, and Angular uses this to apply this kind of validation on this input field. So just next to this input field, I want to add a div. This is where we'll display the validation error. So first name is required. Now to make this pretty, we can apply two Bootstrap classes. One is alert and the other is alert-danger, which puts this in a red box. Now we don't want to display this at all times. We want to display this only if the input field is not valid. So we use the ngIf directive that you have seen before. Now how do we know if the field is valid or not? Well, back here in the console, you saw this ngModel directive, right? And we looked at this control property. This control has a property called valid. From here, we can tell if an input field is valid or not. But there is a simpler way. So let's collapse this property. If you look at the properties of this ngModel directive, we have all those properties you saw earlier as part of this class as well. So here we have valid, which is a computed property. So when we use this property, internally, the ngModel directive delegates to the underlying form control object. So here, as the value of the ngIf directive, we can reference our directive. So earlier we created this template variable, first name. We can type first name dot valid. Now we apply the not operator here. So we'll render this div only if the first name is not valid. Let's test the result. So back in the browser. Okay, you can see the error is initially displayed here, which is a little bit too confronting for the user because they haven't done anything wrong yet. So I will show you how to fix this problem in a second. Let's type something here. Look, as soon as I type one character, the error is gone. And when I delete this, the error is back. So the validation is working. Now let me show you how to show this error only if the user puts focus in this input field and moves away without entering a value. So back here, I'm going to change this condition. I'm going to add first name dot touched and first name not valid. With this, I'm telling Angular to render this div if this input field has been touched, which means it received focus, but the user left this input field without entering a valid value. So let's try it again, back in the browser. So look, initially the error is not here. Now I'll put the focus. If I press tab, I get this error. So this is how we add the validation errors. Next to each input field, we add a div with the validation error and render it only if that input field has been touched and is not valid. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you different kinds of validation errors. So in the last lecture, you saw the required validation error. In Angular, we have a few built-in validators that are based on HTML5 validation attributes. So let's say we want to set a minimum length for our first name. We can set that here. It has to be minimum 3 characters. We can also set a maximum length. Let's say 10 characters. Now finally, we can also apply a pattern. Now, in case of a first name, it doesn't quite make sense, but if you have something that you want to apply regular expression validation on, you can use this pattern attribute. So I'm going to set this to banana, and this means only the word banana is a valid value in this input field. Now, when you have multiple validation attributes, you cannot show them all with one div, like here. We want specific validation errors, okay? So we want to make a small change here. First, I'm going to remove this validation error here. Now, inside this div, we want to have a separate div for each validation error. So, div first name is required. Now, we want to render this only if we have the required validation error. So here, as the value for the ngIf directive, we type first name. Remember here we have a property called errors. Now from here, we can check to see if we have this error required. So in this errors object, we have one or more key value pairs, and the keys are the validation errors. I'm going to show you the content of this errors object in a second. Now let's add the second div. So another div, first name should be minimum 3 characters. Okay. Now once again, we want to render this only if first name .errors .min length is true. Now I'm going to duplicate this, and for the last one, I'm going to use pattern. So first name doesn't match the pattern. Okay. Now let's inspect this in the browser. So initially no error. I put the focus here, move away. We get this error message. First name is required. I type only 1 character. Now look, we have 2 errors. First name should be minimum 3 characters, and the second error is about a regular expression. So if I type 2 more characters, the first error is gone, but the value we have here doesn't match the pattern. So let me change this to banana, and all the errors are gone. So this is how we add multiple validation constraints on an input field. We simply use these standard HTML5 attributes, required, min length, max length, and pattern. And for each error, we'll have a separate div. Now, finally, before we finish this lecture, let me show you the content of this errors object. So once again here, I'm going to type 1, 2. Now let's open up the console. So here's our ngModel. We have this errors object. Look, we have two key value pairs. Keys are min length and pattern. Look at the values. So this object has two properties: actual length, which is 2, and the required length, which is 3. We can take advantage of these properties and render a dynamic message to the user. So here for the min length validation error, instead of hard coding this value 3 here, we can render it dynamically, because tomorrow we may decide to change the value of the min length attribute. We don't want to change this in 2 places, okay? So here we add interpolation and render first name dot errors dot min length dot. Now the property we want to add here is required length. So dot required length. Let's test this. So back here, I type only 2 characters, tab, and first name should be minimum 3 characters, which is rendered dynamically. Back to our form, I want to type an invalid value here. Now, as a best practice, we should highlight the invalid input fields. This improves the usability of our form. So how do we apply a red border to this input field? Well, let's inspect this. All right, here's our input field. Now, there are so many attributes here. Don't worry about them. Just look at this part, class. So we have the form-control class that we applied in our template, but we also have 3 more classes that are added by Angular dynamically. One is ng-invalid, the other is ng-dirty, and ng-touched. We can use these classes to apply styles to invalid input fields. So let's go to styles.css. Here I'm going to add a new rule. So if you have an element with the class form-control, which should be applied on all input fields. And also on the same element, we have ng-touched as well as ng-invalid. I want to make the border of that element 2 pixel solid red. Let's try it. Back in the browser. So I put the focus here and tab, and here we have a red border. As you build forms with Angular, you will notice that your templates get more complex. Now in this video, I have increased the font size, and for that reason, you don't see all the markup here. So we have to scroll to the right. However, on your screen, chances are you have everything in one view. But what I want to point out here is that as a best practice, your code should be formatted in such a way that another developer does not have to scroll to the right and to the left to see what's happening. So let me show you a cleaner way to write this template. We can break up these lines and list 1 attribute on each line. For example, consider this input field. We can add all these attributes like this, 1 on each line. And note that I'm listing all the validation attributes first, so another person, another developer reading this code, they know immediately what are the validation constraints of this input field. After these, I add ngModel, and immediately follow that, I add the name attribute as well as first name set to ngModel. Now, we don't really need this event binding here. This is purely for this demo. And finally, we add ID, type, and class. Now, similarly, we can format our validation errors like this. So we have the parent div. I add all the classes here. And then ngIf. So here you can easily see this ngIf without having to scroll to the left and right. Now for each validation error, we can break it up like this. So I put the error on the next line, and this is much easier to the eyes, like this. So this is the end result, which is way cleaner than what we had before.
Hi, thank you for watching my Angular tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with others. Also, you can subscribe to my channel for free new videos every week. This video is part of my complete Angular course with almost 30 hours of high quality content where you will learn everything about Angular from the basic to the advanced topics all in one course, so you don't have to jump from one tutorial to another. In case you're interested, you can get this course with a big discount using the link in the video description. And if not, that's perfectly fine. Continue